Record. Welcome to a discussion between myself, David Didau, and education's godfather, Martin Robinson. And we're going to be talking a little bit about meaning, and we're going to be talking about the hunt for meaning in education, and whether there is such a thing as truth which we can pursue, or whether it's maybe a bit more complicated than that. And just to get you into our frame of reference, we've got a quotation to share with you from Michael Polanyi, and I will read this aloud in order to overburden your working memory or something like that. Man's origin is a mystery which the myth of creation expresses in its own way, and the image of man's destiny is derived from his mythical origins, is much nearer to our own experience of our own lives, to our experience of human greatness, to our perception of the course of our history since history began, and to our experience of the shattering forces of our utopias, than is the image of the barren atomic topography to which the ideal of detached observation seeks to reduce these matters. Now, arguably in education at the moment, or always to a degree, our mythical greatness, our experience of ourselves, and the long view of humanity's struggle with itself and the environment. As soon as you put that into a curriculum, and as soon as you teach that in a mass education system, do you, by definition, start to reduce this to barren atomic topography? Or is there a way in which we can seek to retain meaning? Martin.
Lovely. Yes. So we can talk about this in various angles. In the book that I wrote about Athena versus the machine, this is very much the tension between wisdom, between perspectives, between the human being part of the picture and the sort of mechanistic schooling, or the way that schooling has tried, or the way it's become, if you like. It becomes something about measurement, about hardly anything to do with us achieving wisdom, if you like, but becoming perhaps knowledge machines, I don't know. But in the same way that a computer might be, in other words, we get a certain amount of knowledge and then we get a grade and we go out into the world and we achieve greatness that way through social mobility. And we've got enough cultural capital to give us the social mobility. It all becomes something that's quite pedestrian in that way. Whereas pursuit of meaning, go.
No, or maybe we amass enough knowledge and we undergo our own individual singularity, in which we achieve wisdom through the accrual of knowledge, and that it's not almost an unintended consequence, perhaps. But one of the things you talk about in your book, and as you mentioned there, is the unfortunate way in which education has been tyrannized by metrics, and everything's been weighed and measured, and as we know, when things are weighed and measured in particular predictable ways, then people align what they do in schools in order to fulfill those particular criteria, and that may arguably have had the effect of reducing the scope of our ambition to something as potentially banal as a grade. But because wisdom, truth, beauty can't be measured, can't be weighed, can't be given a grade, and therefore it's easier and more comfortable if we just ignore it.
Well, to me, this is where we come to the point of view of the subjective and the objective. So the objective is something we can measure and we can give a grade to, and it has to be fair after all. And we can't just throw grades out that mean nothing at all in that sense. So they must have some semblance of something that we can measure and say, look, that's what they've done. So we take away beauty and truth, which are subjective feelings, subjective ideas about what we appreciate ourselves, and sort of mold that into something else. So, and this is particularly something which affects the arts and the humanities, I think, more so than the mathematics and the sciences.
Yes, and so as you know, I've written a book about English as a subject in the curriculum, which I'm toying with the name Making Meaning, or the Search for Meaning in English. And one of the things that I found quite interesting, looking at the history of English as a subject, is that when in the 1890s, it was beginning to try and force its way into the academy. And up until that point, English had really existed in terms of philology, the study of words, the study of dead languages, which is all very objective and scientific and rigorous. And when the attempt was made to introduce English literature, it was quite famously dismissed as chatter about Shelley. And the idea, that it was confronted with is like, if literature is about becoming wiser, becoming acquainted with truth and beauty, and about forming new experiences and becoming more rounded human beings, those things are great, but possibly they have no place in a university education because they can't be measured, grades can't be awarded, and therefore, and so initially, the idea, the move to open up higher education with English literature degrees was dismissed on this basis that it couldn't achieve the kind of objectivity required. And then in the next couple of decades, it did force its way in, and by garbing itself in objectivity, fashioning for itself an approach to the subject of the domain which was suitably rigorous, which enabled universities to examine students' knowledge of the subject. And the discipline that we have in schools, the subject in schools, is necessarily a descendant of that struggle. And we're living with the consequences of that, for better or worse.
Right, and this is where, I mean, it goes back to your original statement. We could accrue a certain amount of knowledge, and in a way that is objective knowledge, and from that we can then magically become knowledgeable beings. But it's how that knowledge comes to us that matters as well. So if you develop things like a palate, you develop taste, you develop an aesthetic awareness, your political ideals and ideas, your opinions about things, all these are part of what a true rich education should include. In other words, bringing the self into the picture of the social and the cultural, and those relationships between, well, in case of a book, perhaps the book, the reader, and then the societal view of that book and the reader reading that book, and all these, and the arguments that are there in this society as well, make it a different proposition to teaching a poem is a different proposition to teaching a mathematical equation.
Or is it?
Yes, it is.
Well,
no, it is. Yes,
no, but
of course.
If you're just, I mean,
you can teach me a poem that. You can teach me a poem and say, this is what you need to know. This is how it's structured, all those things, the grammar of it, how it works and all those things, which is perfectly good. And nothing wrong with that. And I'm not saying that's not part of it. That is part of teaching the poem. But if you just leave it there, then the poetry appreciation, if you like, what is it a good poem? How do we know it's a good poem? We don't necessarily, but there are elements of it that we can start to develop a palette for. So how would you do that with a wine or whatever it is, or a football team or a football game, which, is it beautiful? Is it pedestrian? Whatever these things are. The actual world of education, to bring the subjective and the objective to some sort of semblance of a unity, perhaps there. Or what's the term of? Yes. Is it Shelley or is it Keats? I can't remember. It's Keats, isn't it?
Well,
where you put two things together.
Negative
capability.
Keats, yes.
Yeah. and that sort of idea of pulling those two things together, where the objective and the subjective come together. They might not fit exactly, but we can actually have the two side by side, is quite an interesting point. Now, the trouble with an education system that is grade led, which is chasing grades right throughout the system, so we've got traffic lights, we've got all these other things going on, is it takes away the subjective and tries to say, well, that doesn't actually matter at all. We don't need to develop those things. You just have to be going green all the way through on your spreadsheet or something like that.
And I'm just sort of thinking about that letter in which Keats first mentions the idea of negative capability, and I don't think, arguably, it's not about trying to hold subjectivity and objectivity together. It's trying to hold two contrary subjective ideas together without, as he puts it, the irritable reaching after fact and certainty. Almost it's the hunt for an objective truth which reduces and makes less the tension of ideas. And I think, was it his, I think Lamia, his poem Lamia, where he talks about the dangers of unweaving the rainbow. Wordsworth expressed it similarly in The Tables Turned, the idea that we murdered to dissect, and that by trying to work out why it's beautiful, we do something damaging to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other part of it is that the objective view in a lot of education is a false objectivity. It's not really objective. It's subjectivity dressed up as something else. We're pretending that these things mean something when actually they don't mean much at all. So we're chasing a data stream that doesn't necessarily add up to much, but it takes a lot of energy and time, mind you.
Chasing the pretense of objectivity. Yes, so it makes it feel that we're productive, and so one of the things which I know that you've thought about, and I'm not sure that whether you've necessarily sort of publicly said anything about it, but the current maybe obsession's not a fair way of putting it, but the current focus on pedagogical approaches which maximize retention are aligned with this idea that there are objective truths which can and should be learned, and that possibly it's the wrong focus.
It's a good focus to have. It's a part of a palette of different foci. Is that a word? Yeah, it is focus. But whether you can get to focuses, crocuses, but whether sorry, start again. So whether it's the only focus, where it's the only focus, it's problematic. So I think it can take over. So you get to a point where the retention becomes more. So for instance, in your key stage 2 SATs exam, that if you say this about this poem, then you'll get a good tick on your reading test, reading exam or whatever. It says this is what you're doing. You say this, it'll do well. Or if you say that in your maths exam, it's a different thing altogether. So what sort of things are out there? Well, quizzing, all those things, which are an important part of what we do as teachers for retention of a certain type of knowledge. But if that's how it ends, then we're left with a rather barren landscape.
Yes. Now, a way to reply to that would be to say that's a straw man position, that nobody is necessarily seeing that as an end to which they're aspiring. But it may be a necessary precondition for the sense of connoisseurship, the sense of taste that you were talking about earlier, that if you don't know things, if you don't have an educated opinion, then what kind of opinion do you actually have? You just have prejudice. And so in order to sort of elevate our palate, we perhaps do need to first know things, and that maybe techniques, approaches to education which prioritize those things are an important and necessary step.
Yeah, it's important to know things, but what things you know then becomes even more important. So the choice of what you put in a curriculum is very important.
Of course.
What to know and what to know about those things. And then also, to me, that those things have a range of perspectives, that we see things from different angles. We see things in a bigger way, if you like, than just say, well, here's one poem. You're going to look at it. It's in the anthology. Right, we need 3 poems. So we're going to look at those 3 poems, and we're going to train you to say the right things in an exam all the way through. And it's going to take us 3 years because, you know, you find it more difficult because of this. Yeah, you know, whatever it is. So rather than, here's poetry. Let's look at poetry in the breadth. Let's widen out our studies of poems. Let's find out what's a sonnet structure, what, you know, what's a limerick or a haiku or whatever. Look, these different structures. Yes, but you know more about things. You don't just limit it to knowing the right things about things to say about this particular thing. And you develop your palate, you develop taste, you develop perspectives, and you develop argument and debate. And that's the way that you improve your idea upon the world, and also about changing your mind about things as well.
Yeah, no, I like your example about limericks there, and you can teach somebody that a limerick has a particular structure and a particular rhyme scheme. But I just happen to have a fabulous example of a limerick here from W.S. Gilbert. And the question is it a limerick? And it goes like this. There was an old man of St. Bees who was horribly stung by a wasp. When they said, does it hurt? He replied, no, it doesn't. It's a good job it wasn't a hornet. Is it a limerick? And does it matter?
Well, it's a limerick. It's playing with the limerick form.
Yes. I mean, it's written by somebody who knows what a limerick is.
Yeah. So if you didn't know the limerick, and you didn't know the limerick form, then that would have no reason behind it at all. You just sort of look blankly at someone. But the knowing the limerick form, and you're hearing the rhyme that could be there.
Yes.
And you think, oh, and it's playing that. So the same, this is the role of the avant-garde, you know, is always to push, to say, right, you've given me a form, now I'm going to punch against that a bit and have fun with it, or play against it. And always the art form moves. Culture moves. That's the other reason why you should have different things taught and not just set in stone. Culture moves. It's an organic thing. It's an organic process, you know, and curriculum should obviously reflect that, I would have thought. So teach that, but you can't teach that if you haven't taught limerick.
Right. So you've got to know what a limerick is, and so if knowing what a limerick is a precondition to appreciating Gilbert's playing with the form, then is it valuable? Is it reasonable to ask people, so what is a limerick, and to expect them to be able to talk about scansion and rhyme, or is that a waste of, you know, is that unweaving the rainbow? Is that a negative step? And that, I think that's an interesting tension, and it's at work in what we do. And I think, you know, I've heard you in the past talk about a friend of yours called, is it Ken Campbell, the theatre impresario, who talks about, do you want to tell the story about his view on creativity? Because I'm sure you'll do it more justice than me.
Martin, yes, well. No, well, he talked about what's creativity to him, what's the one component above all others that you need for creativity. And he talked about constraints, that you need constraints. So you need constraints, Martin. So he would talk about, right, if you just tell me a story, just tell me something, and you just sit there blankly. He said, right, well, tell me a story that every word in it doesn't have the letter E in it. And then you start thinking through this constraint, upon a time, no, right. So the constraint then gives you into the improvisation, if you like. It helps create something for you. Or here's 3 chords and a guitar, you know, create a song. So anything that constrains your thinking in some way gives you another focus, which actually helps you create something. So the limerick form helps you create something, whereas just the blank piece of paper thing, which is frightening to some writers sometimes, doesn't give you that. So the constraints help you, and you teach constraints. I mean, culture is constraint. It's ways of seeing the world. We come to meaning through constraints around us. This is a way of seeing. But of course, if it's only one constraint, this is the only way of seeing, I think it becomes problematic, because that's not freeing for the person doing it. So coming to meaning in English, when you're reading something, how would you describe that process? I mean, is it meaning to the reader, or the meaning that the teacher says is the meaning?
Right, and how does the teacher know what the meaning is? Because they've looked it up in their study guide, they've gone on CliffsNotes website and found out the meaning, and now they're transmitting it to their eager, fresh-faced charges. Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, I think one of the interesting ways of defining these things is also by, or attempting to reach towards definitions, is by also talking about what they're not. And one of the things in putting together the ideas in this book that I've found particularly important, a place to look, has been the philosophy of Michael Oakeshott, and particularly his essay, The Voice of Poetry in the Conversation of Mankind. And he sort of acknowledges that the Conversation of Mankind is far, far larger than the voice of poetry, but he also makes the point that it's dominated by the voice of science, the voice of practical concerns, and that the voice of poetry it's very easy for it to go unheard. And during the course of reading that long essay, I found a little. At one point, he talks about the various different subjects within the curriculum, and I found this that he said, which I'm going to read to you about, which I thought was particularly apposite for language and literature. And he talks about the language is recognised not, and here he is saying what it isn't, not as the means of contemporary communication. So that's out. What's important is they're an investment in thought and a record of perception and analogical understandings. And I thought that's a rather interesting and beautiful way to look at it. And he talks about literature as the contemplative exploration of belief, emotion, human character and relationship in imagined situations, liberated from the confused, cliche-ridden, generalised conditions of commonplace life, constituting a world of ideal human expressions, inviting neither approval nor disapproval, but the exact attention and understanding of those who read. And that the instincts, you give a young person, a young teenager, a poem, and what do you think of this? It's shit. It's poetry. It's shit. And it invites their disapproval, and it invites their disapproval because they struggle to pay attention to it, because it's alien and unfamiliar. And so it doesn't invite their understanding, and they find it hard to locate within it a record of thoughts. And because they don't know enough that would be useful to understand it, they can't make those analogical links between this and this on the page and that I know from elsewhere. And so they're blocked. And so what I think's really interesting about those two almost disciplinary qualities of analogical understanding and of exact attention. I think there's a really interesting relationship between those processes that, one of the things that on English teachers will balk at and get upset by is the idea that children feature spot, that they read through a text and they go, there's a metaphor, there's a simile, there's some end-stopped rhyming or whatever, and that's all they know, so that's all they say. And actually, the idea of exact attention or noticing, being aware, is not just being aware of the metaphor or the simile or the end-stop rhyme, it's being aware of the whole ecosystem. It's seeing the entire forest and the place of that individual tree in the forest. But to be able to do that, you've got to be able to see the part and the whole at the same time. And to see the part and the whole at the same time, I think you've got to have experiences external to the text that allow you to make analogical understandings, to be able to, arguably all our understanding is analogical, that we understand, we think by categorizing and sorting and saying, this is like that or it's not like that, and that's obviously quite rudimentary, and it becomes much more sophisticated. But the more categories we possess, the greater the possibility of arriving at interesting analogies. Does that make sense?
And the interesting thing with Oakeshott and his ideas on conversation, and perhaps there's a tension here between that he also sort of talks about that not much will come out of things, that it's really sort of, his idea of an education is almost that it might not lead to anything in particular, but that does it really matter if it doesn't, that sort of thing. So he's got this sort of very open-ended feeling about it.
Which is,
and of course for the teacher that we are, we've got to deliver something with a grade at the end of it, and there is that tension. So which we have to sort of come to some sort of arrangement with at some point. What I'm interested in what you're saying is, because I always say that we shouldn't ask kids their opinions yet, that we should say, hold your opinion at the moment. The first prejudged thing you're going to come up with, don't even go there. I know we have this immediate feeling when we come across something of disgust or fear or love or hate, whatever it happens to be. But we want to hold that for a minute and try and put it into, let's have a look at what other people have said about this, or let's look at different angles of looking at this before we get to the point of actually saying what we feel. So it takes time to develop a response to something, and building up the whole wood, and just rather than the straightforward response to that particular tree at that moment. Sorry, you were saying.
No, and returning to your idea of a teacher saying this is what you need to know about this poem, a way of capturing a sense of the conversation and the tension and the dialectic is to say, some people think this, some people think that. They can't both be right, because they're in conflict, and if you want to integrate these ideas, go for it, but be aware that there are tensions that mean they're not really compatible. And by the way, here's a third.
But they could both be right. They could both be right, and in because of where they come from.
Well,
and this is where you bring the perspective in. Looking at it from over here and looking at it from over here might be slightly different perspectives, which give us a slightly different view of something. So it's something which is controversial. For example, if you're teaching a book, I don't know, Conrad or something, you might be looking at it in very different ways depending on your viewpoint of something. And that leads to looking at those things. They might both be correct in their view, but from then your perspective comes into that, and your perspective might be, well, I'll take that from that point and that point, the thesis and the antithesis, if you like, and I'll create a synthesis that is now my view, which is more correct than their views. Meaning.
Yes. And I think so. Well, yes, and here's that's perhaps the central tension of approaching something subjective, like a piece of drama or a poem, and saying this is what it means, because it only means that if you share the same set of experiences and perspectives as the person who generated that perspective. The idea that we can find links and connections which other people haven't necessarily experienced before, and that they have a validity. They need to be defended. They need to be justified. They need to be They need to be shown how they fit within and make sense. But just pointing and saying that's what it means is perhaps dishonest.
Yeah. And we've got another problem coming up here, which is relativism. That
yes,
everything is what I say it is. It's my opinion, so therefore. And that's where we miss out the other point of view, which is well, there's a cultural view, there's a societal view. Yes, there are conflicts within that, but some things are better than other things.
yeah.
Generally, a kiss is usually better than a punch. Not all the time, depends on your proclivities, but
And
just generally.
perspective.
Yes, your perspective on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there are some things better than other things. And so this cake has, this cake doesn't taste nice to me. This cake tastes nice to me, etc., etc. But then there are standards of cake. If you look at Bake Off, there are ways of arriving at truth, at what's better than some things are better than other things. But it's never an objective art. It's always a subjective art. But within that subjective, there are certain
boundaries. There are limits.
There are limits. There are standards.
Well, there are also limits that you can make. If you make a Chelsea bun and it doesn't look anything like a Chelsea bun, is it a Chelsea bun?
Is it a limerick?
Currants, if you haven't used flour, I don't know. There's a point at which you'll go beyond the limits, and it will no longer be the thing you set out to make. But
with the limerick case, then there is also the ability to do that, because time comes into it as well. So Van Gogh wasn't recognised in his time as being good, but retrospectively he is. So it's not an obvious art form, put it that way, of saying that this is the standard.
No. And is Stormzy better than Mozart?
Yeah.
And obviously, as we know, that generates a lot of tension, a lot of disagreement, which is kind of odd and interesting, because we have Stormzy wins Best Artist in a musical award ceremony. He's the best male solo artist. He's better than all the other ones. So clearly, we believe it's perfectly possible to make objective standards and judgments, because we can say Stormzy is the best. But then as soon as we want to say, or some people want to say, he's not as good as Mozart, then that becomes controversial.
Yeah, and rightly so. He's probably better to dance to.
Yeah.
It's difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, there are also things like, well, if you're looking at it from a musical perspective, you're teaching music, you might be teaching in the round of saying, well, here's some Mozart, here's some Stormzy, this is how harmony works, this is how rhythm works, compare and contrast, have a look at those things. Should you be saying beyond that Stormzy is not as good at doing this thing, but Mozart's not quite as good at doing that thing, and take it down into some sort of scientific taking it apart and then sort of demonstrating this is objectively better than this, or is it or you look at it in the whole, and we start talking about taste, and perspective comes into it. But if the kid says, I hate Mozart, it's bad, but I love Stormzy, and that's their way in, and you're leaving it at that,
yes,
then I don't think you're giving the kid a way into appreciating what Mozart has to give, and or vice versa. It might be a kid who loves Mozart and hates Stormzy. So it might be that you want to say, well, here's the qualities here, and you might give your own personal opinion, and you might give an opinion of, great musical connoisseurs of who look at this in the round from an expertise point of view, an expert's point of view, and saying, well, this is actually good at this, that, and the other. And it might be good South London drill music, or whatever you want to say, has a certain cachet, but it doesn't mean that you would then accept the prejudicial argument, this is better than this, and that's the end of it. You want to have a discussion in the round that people actually understand what each brings to the table, and therefore also what society thinks and why it might think that, or what culture might think in this moment in time. should say.
So maybe
It's
maybe a better tension is is it important? Should it be taught that Hamlet is better than Harry Potter?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
I tell you, you've got the difficult thing is now we've got the whole going on to Trip Find or whatever it is, that sort of thing about Amazon, 5 stars, put 5-star reviews on there, 4-star, 3-star, 1-star, boring, whatever it happens to be, that populism takes over, that we've got this, this idea that, well, they've got 300 reviews and they're all saying this, so therefore it must be good. And I think we've got to get away from that and think about, rather than how many people like something or how many people say it's good, that we've actually got to grab hold of saying, well, what's the intrinsic quality of something itself, the thing itself? And how do we judge that, rather than just the immediate market value of something that people want to buy it, they want to like it. There might be a say in that, but the popular of popular culture in these days can be, it's marketed well. It might not be a good product.
But I guess the question I'm sort of asking is, should children be taught to understand why Hamlet is better than Harry Potter? Or
they should be taught how to get, well, again, because if we get back to it, I would say that, to me, it's a straightforward answer. Yes, it's better. Now, where do we go from there? The kid hates it and can't find why it's better yet.
Yes.
And so I think, but they are reading Harry Potter and getting something from that. So if you just tell them, well, Harry Potter's shit, and therefore your taste is shit, and therefore you're shit, and you've got all that going on.
Right.
But what you're trying to do is say, well, here's the way to garner meaning from Hamlet.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to use now.
Better doesn't imply anything's shit.
No. But it can do, can't it? If you say this is better, this is a better thing, this is far better, but the kid in his own mind, she is thinking, or he is thinking, it's shit. I don't understand it. I'm alienated from it, or whatever. I hate it. Then it's in the parlance, their understanding of it is that it's rubbish, and I hate it. You can hate Shakespeare, and there are adults who've gone to the top universities, who hate Shakespeare. They hate it, and will say, well, I hate Shakespeare, just as others will say, I hate maths. There is an emotional response to these things that we have to take into account, because we're teaching human beings, not just this is what you need to say about Shakespeare. We're saying, well, here's a way of garnering meaning that matters to you, and it might not matter to you yet. In 20 years' time, we've given you some foundation as a way into this, perhaps.
So this is clearly it's a microcosm, and it's something where we're actually talking about something bigger than these two things. But the question I'm asking is should children receive an education which allows them to understand why one thing might be better than another thing? Hamlet, Harry Potter doesn't really matter too much, although it's interesting that you can get educated opinion that says Hamlet's not great. That T.S. Eliot said there's no doubt it was an artistic failure. Now, I might want to reply that that's failure of imagination, and that, but it's an educated opinion. He's not just that's not prejudice. And so if at the end of, or if at a point during the process of introducing children to these ideas, they go, look, I know what you're saying, and I've taken on board your argument, and I still don't like it. I don't have any problem with that. I think people have to be free to exercise their judgment and say it doesn't float my boat. But I do think as well, it's important that they're equipped to explain why.
Yeah, and T.S. Eliot, I would have thought T.S. Eliot probably could articulate why he didn't think Hamlet was good from an educated point of view, which is different than saying it's shit from an ignorant point of view, or a fearful point of view, or I haven't got a way into that, so therefore I close that door. the way into saying Stormzy is better than Mozart for a great music teacher, if that's the response, for someone who can then articulate an argument as to why Stormzy is better than Mozart, in some whichever strange sort of world that would actually be, that contrast. But let's say that's it, because you can like both, of course, but and equally, but in different ways.
Well, you can like both, but can you think they're both the best?
In different contexts.
Right, because the thing, and it doesn't, Stormzy and Mozart and Hamlet and Harry Potter are, they're besides the point. But one of the things, one of the issues with the relativism that you began with, especially in the arts, is that we've had some considerable time now where it's routine to hear people say you can't. There's no sort of objective measure of quality, and therefore anything is potentially as good as anything else. Famously, you had Terry Eagleton sort of arguing that a bus ticket could be as worthy of study as a Shakespeare play. He didn't actually really say that, but he rehearsed the argument. And I think other people have said it in all seriousness. And I think the way that has played out in schools is that in a subject like English, there is no objective standard of quality. That what we're doing, the way we're trying to make meaning, is that we're teaching you a set of skills which you need to learn to eventually use those skills in an examination. And because these skills are more or less transferable, and because quality is arbitrary, it doesn't really matter what we read or write about. What matters is, that you practice the skill, whatever we deem that to be. And therefore, we might as well study young adult novels or ephemeral pop culture pieces as the canon, and that if we do, if quality really is arbitrary and everything is relative, and there is no way of saying that something's better than something else, and it's just our preference that matters, where does Well, firstly, that may, if that's true, and if that's right, that's one set of things. The other side of that, and it'd be interesting for you to say, because I know you've written about this recently from a perspective of teaching theatre studies, is that the skills that we're hoping that children will acquire. What if they're not skills? What if they're not things that can be learned and practiced in the way that we normally think of skills? What if they're actually the product of analogical understanding? And that only builds up by having a wide enough, broad enough pool of analogies and categories to draw from.
Yeah, it's anything that takes away the object that you're talking about, I think, is problematic. So if I'm looking at something, the urn, the Grecian urn or whatever I'm looking at, and then you take that away, and I've never seen that Grecian urn, and then you're trying to give me a set of skills to appreciate said object that isn't there, I have no way of imagining it. I have no understanding of the thing itself. So when you put the urn there in front of me, I can then start to develop a vocabulary that's connected to the thing itself. So it's not floating around something else. So if I'm going to talk about theatre, I need to see theatre. I can't just have a set of ideas about nothing in particular. I have to see it in situ, because then I'm going to start working at describing theatre itself, if you like. Now, if I see different types of theatre, different writers, different actors, different performers, different ways of performing theatre, and I start looking at those things side by side and comparing and contrasting them, I'm building up even more of a vocabulary, because I'm saying, well, this is what this does, this is what this does, this is what this does, here's how they're different. And then I can finally, I prefer and this is why I prefer this from my perspective upon these things. But I can see that you might prefer that, or why you might prefer that. And then, which one's better? I think we have to ask that question, and people do. We're forever, putting books in lists. Which are the best books? Which are the worst books? Which is the best piece of music? Which is the best album of all time? Rolling Stone will have top 50 albums or whatever. We like doing these things because of the conversations that come from that. Sorry, yeah.
No, exactly right. So we obviously think that creating lists, creating canons is worth doing because we do so much of it, and the interesting thing I think about canons is that they are disputed. That not everyone agrees. I remember.
Exactly.
I remember I think it was 20 years ago or so. I think probably the BBC or something ran a poll on the 100 best novels, and number one, I don't know if you remember, was The Lord of the Rings, which is not very good. And but it's number one. And why is it number one? Because it's the most popular. But also, it's a potentially valuable piece of a cultural artifact in its own right. It has all sorts of. This list was before the movies, so you couldn't just go and see the film. If you wanted to experience, you had to read the book, and it was obviously important enough to be up there, and obviously well beloved by very many people, just not me. And so, that it immediately, the response is, I think, or certainly a response, but I think a very common one is to go, well, that's not what I would put at the top. I would put this or that. And we immediately, as soon as we're confronted with a list, we replace it with our own. Or if we don't agree.
And I've forgotten who said this, but the importance of writing lists and having lists is that they're always an etc. at the end of it. There's always more to be said. This is not concrete. The fact you have a list, it's always going to have things that change or move about it. It's never, this is it. So Lord of the Rings, as soon as you say that, well, it isn't. Well, an educated group, educated class could look at that. Let's say it's a year 11 class, a year 12, 13 class, or whatever it is, or year 6 class, we're going to say, year 5 class, could be looking at a list and then using what they know and developing their language to appreciate, poetry appreciation, list appreciation, which is the best picture book, whatever it happens to be, to develop the language. Yeah.
Officially,
but also we need the societal view, the cultural view, the expert view, because as soon as you say their Lord of the Rings isn't very good, and saying it from your perspective of teacher or whatever, then, I like it, like it, Governor. Exactly. And we have to therefore have that negotiate, knowing that it's from why the expert might say this. And vice versa. Why might you like it? Have you been fooled by its popularity?
So I guess the point that I'm groping towards here is that the list is an important part of meaning, because we either, we define ourselves within it or against it. I've got another little short quotation here from Toni Morrison, the Nobel laureate, who, quite well known, canon building is empire building, and canon defence is national defence. Canon debate, whatever the terrain, nature, and range, is the clash of cultures, and all interests are vested. And I don't really have I think, I could be wrong on this, I think that Morrison's argument is therefore that canon curation is a bad thing. But I think that it's a thing. Whether it's good or bad is a separate point, and probably a lot to do with perspective. But I think that can be true, and also her take on it can be true as well. I don't have a problem with her.
But isn't that where it depends if the canon has been created without your say by other people, and you have no perspective that is going to be listened to or taken into account. That's a slightly different thing than people talking about, oh, well, I disagree with that because of this, that, and the other, which is a slightly more, I don't know the word, democratic, I don't know, way of looking at a canon, in that a canon is a movable thing rather than always it is this is it. But a curriculum is its own canon. As soon as you set a curriculum in school, that is a canonical thing. You are saying that these are the books that our department, our school say are more important than. So the way you present that, perhaps you need to say, well, what you're not reading here has, go out and look at these things if you are so interested, or if you'd be so interested in doing that. So there's other things as well. And if you then say also, it's Appiah talks about this, if you then sort of say that these books are best because they're written by the best people. So these are the best people, they write the best stuff, and this is saying so much about this culture, these are the great works of that culture. And that can become problematic as well. You don't necessarily look at the greatness of something in those terms. So the obvious one is the Beethoven listening, Goethe reading Commandant from a concentration camp. He doesn't become a better person because of it. Wagner's not a better person because he wrote spectacular music, but he's also an anti-Semite. We've got all these things that come into it. We can argue against and for things, but that's
obviously a very sound argument against the sort of Matthew Arnold view of culture being in some way, replacing religion and making us good. I think George Steiner was very good on that, sort of in the 1960s, sort of saying exactly that point, that you can read Rilke in the morning and you can go to the gas chambers in the afternoon, and those things can be perfectly compatible. That there's more, there is no knowledge, there is nothing out there that's going to make you a better person. It's the meaning that you make of it. It's the way that you fit it into your experiences and your history that alter.
Well, is there a way in meaning that you're looking for goodness, that you're looking for morality, that you're looking for a truth that can make you a better person, that can make you feel more, or make you more empathetic? I'm just arguing against myself now, but is there?
If you're a theologian, you would be arguing that there was.
Yeah, but if you're a human being, you want the good life, perhaps. This is something that happiness, or whatever it's called these days, flourishing. That somewhere along the line, we would like art to give us something more than just it's a thing just lying there. The Grecian urn is a thing, but then what we bring to that thing and what it brings to us is quite important as well. So it's not just us looking upon it and saying, it gives meaning to me. It has something intrinsic quality of itself in itself as well, which can elevate us perhaps.
Maybe. So obviously the idea of aesthetics isn't enough to make something worthwhile. That Keats' proposition that truth is beauty and beauty truth, and that's all you need to know, is probably wrong, because I think that what we crave is purpose, is that there's a point and things to work towards and something to be part of, and that those things are really an important part of meaning, and probably an important part of lists, the curriculum, your place within, your perspective on these things. Either your purpose becomes defense or attack of the things that you learn about, but other approaches, of course, but we define ourselves in relation to what we know, and this is something that Michael Young talks about in his writing about powerful knowledge. That he says, that children don't. It's not facts that's important. It's a relation to knowledge that we have an entitlement to, And how do you know, going back to the point that you make about, you know, someone hating Hamlet because there's no way in, that it's the way in that's important. And how can you have a relation to Hamlet or Pythagoras or whatever else it is?
It's interesting you talk about Michael Young's thing there. So powerful knowledge, which is the knowledge you might be taught at school, for instance, yeah, and that's kind of where he might come from or whatever. Let's go back to Stormzy. Is knowing Stormzy powerful knowledge?
According to Michael Young's definition, no. But then
is Mozart
also he would also
is knowing Mozart.
Pardon?
And knowing Mozart is
no, Mozart not knowledge either. He would write off most of the arts in this sense.
Yes, exactly.
But he doesn't think that they're not important or that people shouldn't have them. He just says it's not really powerful knowledge. And his definition of powerful knowledge is about being able to make generalizations, and so that you learn this, and that allows you to go, well, if this is true, then that will be true as well, and it will be true there and here and everywhere because it's universally true. And the problem with the arts is it doesn't really work like that. You know, one of the sort of traditional defenses, for instance, of Shakespeare was that Shakespeare plays taught us universal values, but that's not really true. You know, that people don't behave like King Lear or Macbeth. They might recognise some of their behaviour in some of these characters' behaviour, but you know, one of the dangers, one of the problems with the universalisation, the generalisation which comes from that kind of knowledge is that we find it, you know, we see a couple of kids madly in love, they're just like Romeo and Juliet. And we've made a sort of, we've stereotyped, we've made a shortcut, look, a bossy woman, what a Lady Macbeth she is, you know, and we do this kind of thing. And so, you know, the power that the artistic knowledge, the arts generates doesn't give us power to generalise. It gives us a perspective on things which people have considered beautiful and true over the ages, but they don't really.
Doesn't science work in a similar way? If you give us the analogy that the brain is like a computer, then it's just like a computer. You can put things in there, and suddenly, so isn't that a limitation of language rather than the arts?
You know, maybe it's a limitation of our ability to think. I mean, it's very difficult for us to think without metaphor. Arguably, if we're talking about a subject like English, something that I would consider to be powerful knowledge is not the poem itself or the text itself, but knowing about how metaphors work and how our thinking is shaped by stating positions, this is like that, and that we come to understand that because we've seen or held or felt this.
But doesn't that denigrate the idea of even using metaphor at all? Because it's just like that, so we can dismiss it. Isn't that dismissive? Whereas without the constraint of that metaphor, we might not have many breakthroughs in thought at all.
Well, all breakthroughs in thought.
What about the word? But let's think about emotions.
True, in thought is a metaphor.
So yeah, but if we, sorry, I missed what you said there. You cut off.
Oh, sorry. I said that I think all human breakthroughs are analogical in their formulation. It's seeing something in relation to something else and imagining a connection. I mean, it's all about making analogies. And right. So this is a subset of analogy.
Okay, let's talk about emotions.
Yes.
And emotion, we have physical. It's a physical feeling.
Can be.
It's something there. But then we say, that's sadness or melancholy or anxiety, and we bring in this language which it isn't actually that. It's still the same dull thud or whatever it feels within us, whatever that is. But our complete understanding of that is through the words we give it and through the way we describe it. And then we go into the mythological world of that, if you like, that melancholy becomes what it is because of the world we actually inhabit.
Well, the word melancholy points to an experience that we do or don't share. So if you're...
But we understand it through language, through art, through poetry, through all those things, through perhaps psychology, through all those things about that becomes our understanding of it. But the actual thing before it was named might have been felt. It might be a universal feeling, but the understanding of it is not universal. But the thing itself might be a universal thing.
Well, if you haven't, I don't know where we're going with this, but if you haven't felt a thing, then it doesn't mean anything. All you've got is the word. The word, words point to something. They're the problem. When we look at the word, it's like looking at a finger pointing. But what the purpose of the finger pointing is what we're pointing at, not the finger itself.
Yeah.
So the word is just.
And what we're pointing at, we that thing that we're pointing at might be the same, but when we're pointing at it, you're looking at it slightly differently than I'm looking at it.
Sure. And melancholy becomes a shorthand that we accept for the sake of argument is what we both mean and what we both feel when we use the word.
And we might even mean different things. Slightly different things. Like red to you might be different than the red I see, and all that sort of thing. So the qualia of it, or whatever, all those things that come in. So therefore we go back to meaning. There might be a universal meaning out there, but whether we can actually grasp it is another matter, because it's completely veiled to us.
Yes, I would say. I mean, I think there are senses in which the way that certain modes of exploration of the universe arrive at sort of things which are potentially more objectively true than other ways, but our ability to feel and experience those things is, it's absolutely, that even the sciences, we understand the sciences through stories and metaphors. We don't, well, I mean, I'm talking for myself here, but I don't think anybody sort of necessarily grasps the thing itself, the pure essence of whatever. What we do is we hear, we see, we sense something, and we construct a narrative, and we say this is like that, and so that then becomes what we're content to have understood.
So we've got the world of metaphor and meaning through that, which is an idealist point of view, and perhaps there's the physicalist point of view as well, the scientific, perhaps the going back to the original quote at the beginning there about the two things there, that we have something which is perhaps in myth, something which is perhaps real, but does myth bring us closer to the real, or can we actually just go straight for the real without looking at the mythological?
Well, no, I don't think we can. I think we can try, and I think in attempting that, we probably just confuse people, or the attempt is a self-deception, because any attempt to sort of, unless you're trying, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you're trying to communicate something, I don't know, in pure equations or something like that, it's still symbols. It's still not
right. Right. So New Scientist yesterday was talking about they've discovered a mathematical way into explaining consciousness, and that to me is like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. 42. Here we go. The meaning of life. So even if it's a mathematical proof that this is it, it's not going to really affect our understanding of consciousness, which is, from our own perspective, the most important thing about us, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And the story we tell of ourselves, and how our story changes. And I think, that our instinct to create fictions, to tell stories, is primal. It's something that is indivisible from ourselves. There's some lovely little examples, like when you listen to an old-fashioned analog clock ticking, you hear what your brain apparently hears the tick of the clock, but what we do, the way in which we internalize that is we differentiate between a tick and a tock, and we turn that sound into something. And I think it was Frank Kermode that sort of said that each tick is a sort of microscopic beginning, and each tock is a feeble apocalypse, or something along those lines. That it is the very simplest of stories that we tell ourselves. That as soon as we're given a set of facts about the world, that we try and make meaning by telling a story about them. There's that lovely acropotical example of the Hemingway's 6-word short story. I think what was it, sort of baby shoes for sale, never worn, and that has power because we turn that into something which causes us to go, how sad. But it's all, that's, I suppose it's like his idea of an iceberg as well. That what lies beneath is what gives the perceptible bit meaning.
Well, and our view of time itself, of course, which is peculiar to ourselves. If you look at Carlo Rovelli's idea, I mean, what is time? Time does time exist in the way that we experience it? Well, perhaps not in physics.
No, and going back to time, really is, for all of us, it is relative. It flies or it drags,
and when you're in lockdown, they say it's dragging in two ways. The days seem to go quicker, but the actual weeks go slower, or something like that. There's some sort of strange thing.
In my experience, it's the reverse of that.
Yeah, or perhaps it's the reverse.
The last 6 weeks has been a bit of a blur, and each day needs to be filled, needs routine and structure. And
with this sort of thing, with
discussion,
we should do it.
With good company.
We should do it again. Perhaps
meaning.
We should take another quote next time, and wrap around that, as they say.
Well, so this has been Martin Robinson and David Didau talking absolute bollocks just for the sake of it. Thanks everybody that's lasted till this point. Goodbye.